Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever found yourself wondering how ancient societies handled justice? Not just, the big empires, but how these really deeply spiritual communities, maybe a bit off the beaten path, how do they navigate everything from like minor disagreements to really serious stuff? We're talking rules, punishment, even rehabilitation, but all within this very specific monastic world. And today, our exploration, this kind of deep dive, it's guided by a really fascinating source. It's a doctoral thesis from the University of Oslo by Phra, Weerachai, Lueritthikul. The title gives you a clue. Exclusion as Penalty, focusing on specific texts from the Mūlasarvāstivāda school found in the Gilgit manuscripts.
That's right. And this deep dive, it's really journeying into what's called the Vinaya. That's the ancient disciplinary code, the rule book for Buddhist monks. We're going to try and uncover some pretty intricate legal ideas, but also the really practical ways they approach justice. We're looking at these specific texts, Karmavastu, Pudgalavastu, Pārivāsikavastu. It's about how these communities actually managed problems, kept order, and even, helped people get back on track. We're really focusing on the legal side of things, the frameworks, less on just abstract spiritual advice.
Right. So our mission today is to figure out how these ancient principles actually shaped a living, breathing community. And maybe what surprising things they can tell us about justice, about discipline, maybe even just about human nature itself. So let's start at the beginning. The foundation, this Vinaya.
Okay, so the Vinaya. At its core, it's the disciplinary code for monks, bhikkhus, and nuns, bhikkhus. And it didn't start as a written text. It began as an oral tradition, passed down, generation to generation. The source suggests for maybe the first 300 years or so it was purely oral. Then it got more formalized at these big Buddhist councils. The famous one is the first council at Rajagaha, maybe 4th or 5th century BCE. That's where Pāli, one of the main disciples, is said to have recited the whole Vinaya.
Recited the whole thing. Wow.
Yeah, quite a feat of memory. And then over time, they started writing things down. So you get the Pāli Vinaya written in Sri Lanka, maybe 1st century BC. The version we're looking at mostly today, the Mūlasarvāstivāda Vinaya, that got translated into Chinese later, like 8th century CE, and Tibetan around the same time, maybe a bit later. And it's important to get this. Different schools developed slightly different Vinayas. They weren't all identical. For example, the Theravāda Vinaya in Sri Lanka, they didn't really have much formal legal stuff happening around them in society, so their Vinaya doesn't get into things like, say, loan contracts. But the Mūlasarvāstivādins, their Vinaya actually covers practical things like that.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't just one rigid set of rules dropped from on high. It was alive. It adapted to the local legal environment, even dealing with stuff like loans.
Exactly. It shows a real pragmatic side to managing these communities.
Okay, so within these adaptive rules, what was the main tool they used for discipline? You mentioned exclusion as penalty in the thesis title.
Right, that's central. Exclusion as penalty. It's a key disciplinary measure.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always just, being physically kicked out. It was more about separation from the normal life of the monastery. And this was usually done through formal community actions, which are called karman.
Karman, okay.
Yeah, formal legal actions.
Yeah.
And there were different types depending on the situation. You had uttapacchaya, that was the legal action for essentially expulsion. Like if a monk just refused to admit they did something wrong or wouldn't try to fix it. But here's the interesting part. Even that expulsion could often be reversed if the monk later showed they were willing to comply.
So a path back even from expulsion?
Often, yes. Then there were actions that involved suspending privileges, like tarjanya karman. That means rebuke or threat. It might mean the monk couldn't go out for alms from lay families for a while, or maybe couldn't ordain new monks. There's a story about Pudgalavastu's disciples who were always arguing they got hit with this. Then there was Nigrhan Kakman, condemnation, considered a bit more severe than tarjanya, but similar sanctions, used for monks who kept repeating serious offenses, the Saṃgha ones, and even a kind of exile, Pravasan Karman, for monks who, say, caused trouble with the local villagers, injurers of families. Though it's a bit unclear if this exile was permanent from the whole order or just from that specific monastery, maybe allowing them to join another community elsewhere. And one more, Pratisahantyakarman, withdrawal of privileges, again similar sanctions, used if monks were contemptuous toward householders.
Wow, okay. That's really intricate. It's not just guilty or innocent, is it? It's this whole graduated scale of penalties. Each one seems designed with a specific purpose, affecting different parts of the monk's life and relationship with the community.
Precisely. It's quite sophisticated.
So you mentioned these formal actions, the karman, and that they had to be done by the community, the saṃgha. How did that work? Was it just a simple vote?
Oh, much more formal than that. These saṃgha and formal actions by the community were serious business, and whether they were legally valid or not depended entirely on sticking to the procedure. Think of it like legal proceedings today. If the procedure isn't followed, the outcome can be invalid.
Okay, so procedure was key. What kind of things did they need to get right?
Well, first, full attendance. A complete saṃgha was essential. Everyone who was part of that community boundary needed to be there. If someone was absent, say because they were sick, their consent or inability to attend had to be formally obtained and announced. You couldn't just proceed without accounting for everyone. Then, the correct order of the ceremony. You had to follow the steps exactly as prescribed. Skipping a part or doing it out of order invalidated the whole thing. Also crucial, the case itself had to be relevant. Vastu, you needed the right number of monks for a quorum. The pronunciation of the Pāli or Sanskrit had to be flawless.
Flawless pronunciation.
Yes, the words themselves had power. And the monastic boundary, the sima, had to be clearly defined so everyone knew who was included in the decision. And maybe most importantly, absence of objection. During the proceeding, if any monk raised a valid objection based on the Vinaya rules, the action stopped. It was rendered invalid.
So one valid objection could halt the entire process.
Instantly. It ensured, or aimed to ensure, complete communal consensus and adherence to the law. It wasn't just what they decided, but how they decided it. The process gave it legitimacy.
That's incredible. It sounds almost like a ritual in itself, ensuring fairness, or at least perceived fairness and legitimacy. You mentioned motions and proclamations earlier. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. There were basically three main ways these formal actions were structured, involving motions and proclamations. The simplest was japti karman. That's just a single request, a motion put to the saṃgha, starting with something like, "This is the motion." The community consents, usually through silence. Then yaptiditya karman. This is a motion, japti, followed by one proclamation anusavana of the question to the saṃgha. And the most formal, used for the most serious matters, was japtikatirtha karman. That's a motion followed by three separate proclamations. This was used for things like ordaining a new monk, applying those heavier penalties like pāyavasa or manata, or giving a formal admonition.
Motion plus three proclamations. Okay.
And these weren't just administrative procedures. They were highly ritualistic, almost performative. The act of speaking the motion and proclamations was seen as an act of settlement, establishing something officially. It defined the situation, confirmed who had authority, and crucially, silence from the monks assembled meant consent. If you didn't object, you agreed. And underpinning all this is the Pratimokkha Sutra. That's the collection of precepts, the specific rules which define the different types of offenses, like the really serious parijika offenses that meant automatic expulsion.
Right.
The serious but fixable saṃgha offenses that needed these formal community actions, and lighter ones like payantika.
It's all interlocking. The rules, the procedures, the community agreement. Okay, let's talk about guilt. How did they think about intent? Mens rea, guilty mind, that kind of thing.
That's a really insightful question, because the Vinaya's approach is quite distinct from, say, modern criminal law sometimes. We can use concepts like animus nocendi, the intention to harm, and mens rea, guilty mind, to help understand it, but the application is specific. The Vinaya wasn't so much focused on guilt in our sense, like proving internal malice beyond doubt. It was more about whether the monk knew they were breaking a rule. And crucially, here's the pragmatic part. Did they conceal the offense?
Ah, concealment again.
Yes. If a monk broke a rule but did not conceal it, they admitted it openly. They were seen as having mens rea. They knew it was wrong, but their openness was key. They'd typically receive manapya, which is like probation or conciliation, a path to reintegration. However, if the monk broke the rule and actively concealed it, that was seen as demonstrating animus nocendi, not necessarily intent to harm someone else, but intent to deceive the community, to undermine the saṃgha's integrity. And for that concealment, they were given pārivāsa, the temporary exclusion we talked about.
Wow, okay, that is a profound distinction. It's not just the act itself, but the cover-up that signifies a deeper problem, a break in trust with the community.
Exactly. Honesty and transparency towards the saṃgha were paramount. Concealment added a whole other layer of seriousness.
So what if someone had concealed offenses for, ages, or committed so many they couldn't even remember them all? How did the system handle that?
Yes, the source covers this. They had concepts for this. Parimana, meaning a definite countable measure, versus aparimata, meaning indefinite or incalculable. If a monk had concealed offenses, or the number of nights they concealed them was just too vast to calculate accurately a parimata, they couldn't do the standard Pārivāsika calculation. So they had a pragmatic solution, the special type of temporary exclusion called Shutantika Parivāsa. It was basically a way to handle these overwhelming situations, granting a kind of standardized period of exclusion that acknowledged the past without getting bogged down in impossible calculations. It was a practical way forward for both the saṃgha and the monk. A practical fix for an overwhelming problem. That makes sense. Let's go back to this idea of exclusion, Pārivāsa. You said it wasn't always physical confinement. So what was the punishment like?
Well, this is where modern concepts can help us understand the depth of it. The source draws parallels using ideas like invisible punishment, a term from criminologist Jeremy Travis. Think about ancient Athens or Rome. Penalties often involved losing rights, status, being socially excluded. It creates this distance, this us versus them. That social and psychological exclusion can be incredibly powerful, even without physical bars.
Right, a kind of civic death almost.
Kind of. And another useful concept is liminality, from anthropologists like Van Gennep and Victor Turner. It describes the state of being in between during rites of passage. A monk undergoing parivāsa, a parivāsika, is in this liminal state. They're separated from normal monastic life, they're marginal, but the goal is eventual reincorporation. It's a transitional phase meant for reflection and change.
So it's a state of being in between. What did that actually feel like for the monk? The text suggests it was psychologically intense. These monks felt like sinners, full of remorse. They feared permanent loss of status, even worrying about their future rebirths, fearing they might not rise above the underground because of what they'd done. They lost privileges, couldn't use their old sleeping place, had fewer comforts. They had specific duties, like informing any visiting monk of their status immediately. It was a constant reminder of their position. And the pain, as the texts sometimes call it, could increase. If they committed another offense during the exclusion period, the punishment could restart from the beginning. That's mula pārivāsika or mulapākaya. Imagine having to start over. That's where the feeling of being sarvakalika, all black, completely marked, might come in.
All black. Yeah, that's a powerful image. It really drives home that punishment isn't just physical. The psychological weight, the loss of identity within the community, that's immense. It's so much more than just ticking off rules in a book. It hits the very core of who they are in that context.
It really does. But, and this is important, the Vinaya wasn't purely punitive. There was still a focus on humane treatment. Pārivāsikas were still given basic needs like shelter and food. The responsibilities they had were framed as tools for discipline and rehabilitation, not just suffering. The source quotes the Buddha's sentiment, "Well now, I should, out of kindness, give them a lift up by my hand." There's this underlying compassion. And the exclusion could even be suspended temporarily for valid reasons, like needing to care for a sick teacher. It shows flexibility and a focus on the ultimate goal, getting the monk back on the right path.
Lift them up by the hand. That adds another layer. Okay, shifting slightly, you mentioned something about precedent earlier, like in modern law.
Yes, exactly. Our source points out a fascinating parallel to the common law principle of stare decisis, which basically means to stand by things decided. In the Vinaya texts, you find this recurring phrase, something like Yova punar enyu pi evajitiya, which translates roughly to, and anybody else who does that same thing should be treated in the same way. That acts just like a law of precedent. It takes a specific case and makes it the standard for future similar cases.
So they explicitly stated that rulings should be consistent.
Yes. And this connects to the idea of the adhikamika, the person who committed the first offense of a particular type. According to the principle, the very first person to commit a specific offense for which no rule yet existed was actually not penalized. They got an apati, exemption. The famous example is Sudina, who committed the first major sexual offense, parajika. He wasn't formally punished because the rule hadn't been laid down yet. But his case became the adhikamika, the precedent. The Buddha used that incident to establish the rule, stating that from now on, anyone doing the same thing would be subject to the penalty.
That's brilliant, actually. It establishes rules based on real events without punishing someone retroactively, but ensures order going forward. The Buddha sets the precedent based on the first case.
Precisely. It's a very pragmatic way to build a legal code. And the authority comes directly from the Buddha as the ultimate law setter.
And once these precedents were set by the Buddha, were they ever changed, or were they pretty much fixed?
That's a key point. Generally, once the Buddha established a precedent, it was considered authoritative and wasn't really contradicted later. This gave the system incredible stability and continuity over centuries. Monks expected these original precedents to hold the answers, or at least the principles, needed to resolve future problems and, as the source puts it, get monks back on track to nirvana.
Amazing continuity. So how does all this ancient law connect to today? Do these practices still exist?
They do, and the source highlights ritualization as key to their survival. These ancient legal procedures have become deeply embedded rituals. A really good example comes from modern Thailand, the Kusutanta Parivasa. This is a living practice, a form of that temporary exclusion, parivasa, that monks still undertake today. It often lasts about 10 days.
10 days of exclusion. What does that look like now?
It involves a very structured daily routine. There's morning chanting, specific cleaning duties, meditation, serving other monks, and crucially, they still perform the act of informing other monks of their status. They'll say in Pāli, Abhante Pārivāsiko, Venerable Sirs, I am a Pārivāsika. Then at the end, there's the reintegration ceremony, the Abhana. The monk formally declares their purity in front of the community, reciting Ahadbante Parisudoti Masako Daritu, asking the Saha to recognize their purity. And what's fascinating is that many monks participating might not fully understand the literal meaning of every Pāli word they're chanting.
They don't understand the words, but they do the ritual. So what's the point then?
Well, this is where ritual works its magic, you could say. It means these ancient legal ideas aren't just dead letters in a book. They're alive in the practice. The power of the ritual, even without full linguistic comprehension, is immense. It works on emotions, it helps guide thinking, it organizes the social group, reinforces the community's values, and channels the individual's intention towards purification and transformation.
So the ritual itself carries the force, even if the dictionary meaning is fuzzy for the participant.
Exactly. The source explains it well. The ritual might have reduced semantic content, the word-for-word meaning, but it maximizes the illocutionary force. That's its power to actually do something, to change the person's status, to persuade, to bind the community. It solidifies tradition, acts as a bulwark against things falling apart, and demands real commitment from the monk. Their intention to purify themselves through the process is what's key, more so than understanding every nuance of ancient Pāli grammar. It's pragmatism in action, again.
Wow. That really brings it full circle. We've gone from these detailed ancient legal texts from Gilgit
All right, the Karmavastu, Pudgalavastu, Pārivāsikavastu.
through the intricate procedures, the psychological depth of exclusion, the idea of precedent,
The focus on concealment versus openness.
all the way to living rituals in Thailand today, where the ancient words still shape lives, even if understood differently. It's been a truly fascinating deep dive.
It really has. We've seen how the Vinaya wasn't just abstract rules, but this incredibly detailed, practical system.
It provided a framework for order, sure, but also for rehabilitation, for maintaining the integrity of the saṃgha, and always with that goal in mind, getting monks back on track to nirvana. The focus on intent, the sheer power attributed to ritual, the careful way precedent was established, it shows a legal approach that was, I think, both incredibly rigorous and deeply compassionate, always aware of the human element and the community context. It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? How many other systems from the past, maybe ones we dismiss as just spiritual or traditional, actually hold these kinds of sophisticated legal ideas and practical solutions? Solutions that might still offer surprising insights for us today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep getting well informed.